Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Coffee Shop Philosophy. As always, I'm your host, Killian Hobbs, managing editor for Being Libertarian LLC, which includes BeingLibertarian.com, Think-Liberty.com, RationalStandard.com, and, of course, Champion Books. I do this every episode where I talk about our social media feed, podcasts, all that stuff, so I'll spare you this time and probably try to come up with something better for the intro because I've been doing this for quite some time now. On a personal note, funny enough, the day before today, on the Wednesday when you're listening to this, because we listened to this on Thursday morning, was actually the 52nd installment of my Bad Argument series. So I've actually been doing this for about a year all told. Really surprising how quickly the time flies on that one. Without further ado, though, I'm going to hop right into today's episode. What we're going to discuss today, I have a guest on here. I'm joined today by Hussain Hill. How are you doing today?
Doing well.
Glad to have you on. Sorry?
Oh, thanks for having me.
Oh, sorry. I've got Hussain joining me here today because we're going to discuss a group that is sometimes controversial. And there's definitely people that have very strong feelings towards them one way or another, or even people that may not have heard of them or might have just a general idea but not actually understand either some of the things that they stand for, some of the things that have happened, whether they consider that positive or negative, they just haven't weighed in on it necessarily. The group is, of course, none other than the Proud Boys. For those of you that are unfamiliar with the group, we will be going through some of their history, some of the background on them, what they're about, and different controversies and things like that that have come up over time. Now, the purpose of the episode, just so that nobody thinks that this is like a standard mainstream media type podcast where I'm just going to be going at it from one angle or another, either singing praises or demonizing. I don't believe in doing that. If you've listened to any other interviews I've done, you know that that's not my jam, as they say. I don't know who they are, but assume there's a day out there that says jam still so that I don't feel old and decrepit here. But for the purpose of the episode here, just going to go through some questions, going to talk back and forth so that we can hear directly from a member what this organization is about. So, if you could kick things off for us here, why don't you give us the primer rundown on who the Proud Boys are?
Okay. Well, I mean, the Proud Boys, based on various sites and or sources, I'm sure that your listeners will have one or another. But essentially, the Proud Boys are just a men's club, a drinking men's club. Once a month meetings, guys who share political values of center right, nonpartisan. Not even necessarily vehemently pro-Trump, actually, but center-right men come together, have a few beers, talk politics. I mean, that's essentially, if you want to know the physical, anatomy of the organization, that's what it is at its core. And I mean, I'll let you guide the trajectory of this interview, but I mean, there's more manifestations than that, and we can kind of get into how those manifestations be. But at the core of the group, it's really just a good-hearted men's fraternity and or drinking club for just guys who are center right, who want to get together and have some beers and talk politics.
So when we're talking about the group here, I know that there's been some involvement that have gone past just general getting together and drinking there.
Of course.
One of the before we get into that, because that leads into a couple other things, though, one of the things that's listed when I was going through one of the websites regarding the stances and things like that there is the concept of Western chauvinism. Can you elaborate a little bit more on what that means?
Oh, yeah, of course. Western chauvinism, and if you look at the word chauvinism, it's associated with like a exaggerated or a vehement passion for. But it's just another term for Western nationalism, and that idea is very much lost upon today's society. But what that would translate to, I guess, in a less academic sense, would be knowing that America and the Western world is great, which was kind of a given to generations before us. My family personally hails from the South, and my grandparents grew up in North Carolina. And they saw some pretty horrible things when they were younger, but both my grandfather and my grandmother still had a sense of patriotism father served, our grandfather served rather. And I mean, it was just a given that they were American. And I think generations before specifically, I'll say Generation X is when this kind of anti-American sentiment kind of start to really take hold, public imagination. But before that, it was kind of a general understanding that the Western world was a good place to live and America was a great place to live. And so what the Proud Boys have done, and of course one has to understand, of course, and I think even the people the naysayers, the Proud Boys understand. There's an undergirdance of tongue in cheek to all of this, but what the Proud Boys attempted to distill with the motto and our belief systems, our pillars, whatnot, is there's nothing wrong with being pro-West. There's nothing wrong with loving with loving America and loving the Western world. It's actually bizarre and counterintuitive for Westerners to kind of shun, the part of the world that allows them to have all these liberties.
Mm-hmm. Now, one thing I wanted to touch on there, because you had mentioned, it's a group of, center-right type people. Now, obviously, for anyone that's familiar with the group, they've seen in various other forms of media that the group's been labeled as, far-right extremists and things like that.
Okay.
Why do you think that that's the image that the group gets if, it's a group of center-right people that are meeting, talking politics, exchanging ideas, so on and so forth? Where do you think they're getting this moniker from, and what's the disconnect that's causing that?
Well, and I think, and this is honestly, this is the part of the conversation I'm really interested in discussing, because people come up to me and or other various Proud Boys at any given time and ask us, what are the Proud Boys about? And the answer we give them is not a very romantic or salacious answer. It's just hey, we're just a bunch of guys that drink. Some people actually get seriously. Some people actually kind of get dismayed when they find out how just grounded and everyday it is. But now the question of why the Proud Boys ended up where it has ended up in the public imagination, I think, is a much more fascinating discussion. And so in that regard, I will go to a brief history of how it came to be. Basically, long story short, its origins were Gavin McInnes and some associates just kind of goofing around and trolling leftists. Pretty much what it came to be. It was a joke. But it was a joke that, once again, a layer of satire with an undergirdance of with seriousness. A joke that was basically the idea of, like, why can't we just have a club for men who are okay with being men, who want traditional families or at least believe in the structure of traditional family values, are okay with masculinity, love the West. Basically kind of harkening back to the Knights of Columbus, the Elks Lodge, things of that nature. But it was very much laced in satire and comedy. And I think the reason why, the direct reason why you see a lot of the manifestations, like the rally culture, was because basically, long story short, right-wing speakers and or conservative speakers, what I've dubbed the new right of that kind of sphere of political thought, those people, and it's some, just some very vocal, well-known right-wing speakers, were being attacked by radical leftists, namely Antifa, at various events. And the Proud Boys were the only, I guess you call them, grassroots organization that would basically step up and say, we'll do security for you. We'll make sure that you can get in and out of the events safely. So from there on, that's when you start seeing more of the kind of rally presence, Proud Boys. And then I think, to answer your question a little more succinctly, I think the reason why people hate us so much is because they know two things simultaneously. They know that we're not white. They know that any cursory catalog of pictures of the Proud Boys within like 3 minutes, you'll realize that that's a silly. But I think what upsets them is they know that to be a fact, but they also know that we actually are pro-Western, and we are Western and or American nationalists in the broader sense that we believe that the Western world and American society is culturally, not genealogically or ethnically, et cetera, but culturally superior to that of other places in the world. And we're not ashamed to say that. And I think it frustrates the modern left, the modern Marxist amalgamation, to see a bunch of multiracial individuals who also, just so out there as well, I am a homosexual. We also induct homosexuals. A group that inducts homosexuals and people of different races and religious orientations, positions, to see that group be very vocal about being pro West and pro America. I think that kind of direct assault really on their narrative is why they find it so threatening. It also explains why, if you look at social media, prominent actual white nationalist organizations and hate us more still have a lot of their platforms intact. Spencer still has a Twitter account. Some other identity figures still have their social media intact, but lo and behold, Proud Boys seem to have a huge problem with trying to stay on social media. I've experienced it. Others have experienced it. So I think what it comes down to is active, just by existing, deconstruct their.
Now, one thing I wanted to touch on there, because that's definitely one of the major things. Because I obviously did a little bit of research before going into the interview here. I don't like being entirely blind, and that's one of the things that I liked that I saw was the fact that, you know, it's an ideological group. There's no backbone basis to, you know, it's this particular group of people or it's this particular sex or particular religion or particular this or particular that. It's more, they have the idea of Western culture, and that's kind of the push point that you guys work from. I actually had a guest on, it was the last episode there where culture came up when we were discussing Thomas Sowell. So it's actually really interesting the way that some of that stuff links over. I have a question about Gavin McInnes, but before I get to that, before I forget the question here, what I wanted to ask here was in regards to libertarianism. Now, this show is hosted on a libertarian network. Most of the people that are going to be listening to this are libertarians, of course. And in that, you know, they believe in libertarianism itself, usually believes in laissez-faire markets, which includes the globalization of markets and things like that. How does libertarian ideology fit in with what you could call the general Proud Boys ideology? And where would it differ?
That's a good question. I think the Proud Boy, I think where libertarianism fits into the Proud Boys is kind of a concept that I've heard others and myself kind of build upon discussion, which is cultural. So basically, in the Proud Boys, the Proud Boys isn't a political organization in the sense that we have, you know, rank and file political ideology. You know, vote this certain way. It's not that at all. It's a collective, it's a social collective. So the cultural libertarianism part, I'd say, comes in when we say basically, you can do whatever you want. You can be a Proud Boy. You can be gay. You can be Jewish. You can be Christian. I'm an ex-Muslim actually, and I'm actually a pagan. You can be whatever theological presupposition you may fit, as long as your ideology doesn't actively attack or call. You know, is not. As long as your ideology and or philosophical presuppositions are not directly adverse to the survival, the intrinsic survival of the Western world and or sovereign American people, and I think that's pretty much it. So pretty much, you know, come as you are, do what you do, as long as you appreciate Western, as long as you appreciate the sovereign individual, and you appreciate things like free speech, and even further than that, because the group was founded by a Christian. Gavin McInnes is a Christian, and there is a majority of the group's members are Christian, and there is an acknowledgement that Christianity, at least as a cultural prescription, has a net positive on civilizations. You can observe that statistically throughout different times in history and just the progression of the Western world. Just to acknowledge the observable benefits of Christianity, it's merely as a cultural presupposition. So that I would say that's one quote unquote requirement, that you're okay with Christianity and that you acknowledge its contribution to the Western world. But besides that, there really isn't a kind of strong-armed kind of exclusionary principle. The only thing that we do say is, because, and this is antithetical, and we've gotten flack from this from the self-proclaimed alt-right, or as I call them, hipster neo-Nazi movement of 2019. They've said, well, you know, you guys, yeah, it's what they are. They truly believe that what we're doing is brand new, but it's been done. What they've been doing has been going on for decades in different. But their whole charge to us is, you guys believe in free speech, but you guys don't allow white nationalizations. Like, well, yes, because free speech is not synonymous with forced association. So we will never advocate for violence against the alt-right. We will never advocate for violence against anybody based on their beliefs. But we are a multiracial organization. We're basically a cultural libertarian organization. And white, any kind of racial nationalists. I mean, the same goes for black nationalists. We don't induct those either. Racial nationalism doesn't really seem to fit into the cultural libertarian milieu of a group like the Proud Boys. And I think that's one of the issues that the quote unquote far right, and I use very hard quotes on that, and the quote unquote far left. I think that's one thing they share, is that they don't understand, or they refuse to understand nuance. And they kind of they intentionally mix free speech with forced association and forced collectivism. So.
Yeah, I find, it's horseshoe theory 101, right? Once you get to the far extremes, you start seeing a lot of similarities on that. And I mean, you can take a look at someone who's actually alt-right, like say a Richard Spencer type, and you go through some of the things that they support and you go, yeah, I'm pretty sure I heard that from the guys with the anti-fascist flags on their sweaters. I'm pretty sure I heard the exact same kind of same kind of ideologies there. It's
Yep.
I want to say confusing, but that would involve it being surprising, and it's not really surprising, unfortunately.
There's I didn't mean to interrupt you, but there's footage of Spencer. Yeah, there's footage of Spencer. I believe it was a talk in Florida. It's when they had a state of emergency, and he says in the beginning of his speech, he's talking to a crowd of BLM/Antifa. He's like, "I agree with you." He says in his speech, he's like, "I agree with like at least 50% of things that you are saying. I agree with you." I will give Spencer this. He's at least open with the fact that he is an identitarian collectivist. I'll give him. He embraces it full bore, so I'll give him credit where credit's due, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to be said for being honest with it. Like if you go back to, I mean, you look at the beginnings of, say, early fascist movements, a lot of them tried to hide behind the concepts of helping the proletariat or anything like that. And then you just ended up with the Bolsheviks and the Nazis and Mussolini's fascism and so on and so forth. And it was all on the pretense of doing all the things that socialism promised to do. And instead it turned into, well, the entire clusterfuck that was that 30 years of Europe. But that's a whole conversation I'm sure we could dive into pretty heavily, though. Keep it more on topic, though. I wanted to swing back to Gavin McInnes. For those in the audience that aren't aware of who he is, he's a political commentator, fellow Canadian, which I know there's some people that listen to this that still don't know, that still get surprised when they find out that I'm like Keanu Reeves and actually Canadian. And that's probably the only way that I'm like Keanu Reeves. But just to loop things over here, he had a pretty successful career. He worked with the Rebel Media, had his own show, so on and so forth, experienced pretty much the same kind of deplatforming that we saw with a lot of other prominent speaking heads that were on the center right to far right range. The one I want to talk about with him, though, was I'll give the MSM picture of it as the way that it was. If you heard it in a 30-second clip based on, CNN or something like that, this is the version you'd hear. And then I want you to kind of clarify and tell me if the version's correct or what the nuances to the situation were. So effectively, there was one of the rallies in which case there was a bit of an altercation between Proud Boy members and supposed members of either, I can't remember if it was Black Bloc or Antifa or a mix of the two, but anyway, a clash of people at a protest. This resulted in a few people facing jail time, and as a result of this, I'm assuming it was part of the plea bargain or something like that, we ended up seeing Gavin McInnes basically step away from the Proud Boys. So from the MSM account, it was basically he washed his hands and stepped away from the group and left it at that point. Now that's like I said, that's the short 30-second version based on the kind of coverage that the event had. Now, obviously, you being actually in the organization, I'm sure you could probably shed some more light on what might have actually transpired there.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. That was during a live speaking event he did in New York City. And that event, it's noteworthy, with the mainstream media will never address that there were threats hurled. There were threats that occurred that were directed towards the College Republican Club was hosted by radical Antifa members of New York. Long story short, with what happened, the boys, my associates, were exiting the talk. They were just talking, trying to leave events. They were, of course, countered by a mob of radical Marxists. The radical Marxists engaged them. They defended themselves vehemently. And Gavin McInnes, and I don't want to put, I don't want to put word in his mouth at all, but stepped down rather, way to help facilitate a more cohesive and positive outcome for the individual charges. Now, if you want more intimate details, that's for Gavin. So it's a pretty cut and dry scenario, but I think the biggest issue with that I have, there's so much to that story that I think more important to talk about than just the legal ramifications. I mean, it's New York City, so New York City. I spent some time, so I know how that town works. And people can quibble about they can quibble about the veracity of some of the Proud Boys that engaged these Antifa members, but at the end of the day, people have to understand that Proud Boys nationwide have been targeted by a multitude, a plurality, if you will, of organizations. And so when there's only a certain point you can push them, what people don't seem to really understand about the Proud Boys, that the majority, like at the very least half, of our group of our members are just regular guys with regular jobs. They're not political activists necessarily. They're just dudes who want to be and what they're being turned into. It's beyond misrepresentation. It's like a perverse characterization. And when you're dealt with that vitriol and you're attacked, the response is relatively visceral. So. And I saw a lot of pundits who I've addressed them in my online. But there's some pundits that I saw, some relatively prominent, quote unquote right, who condemned the Proud Boys alongside with the leftist media. And I think this is a problem with conservatives and center right individuals, is where we think that being common sense conservatives and being rational. There comes a time, up until the point your fist connects with my face, like you can yell at me, you can call me names, you can say whatever you want about me, but if you put your hands on me, I have a right to defend myself. And the Proud Boys are the only prominent, well-known right-wing organization that does that. That will actually say, we're not going to start any violence, but we will defend ourselves because we are sovereign citizens. You don't have a right to attack us because you. So that's the basic gist of what that story was. It was radical political actors attacking people who were leading a lecture, a political lecture that had a little bit of comedy spring, and they were attacked by these individuals, and they defended themselves. And the media ran the story, and and added to the further demonization of the Proud Boys going forward.
So on the, I guess looping back a little bit here, one of the last questions I'll ask you here, because I think we're running a little bit close on time. I'm okay running a little bit over, but I know we both have little time constraints and all that. One of the questions I want to ask you here would be involving let's say more your views, not necessarily just Proud Boy views, but your views here. We see everything that's going on in the United States, and it's a lot. There's a lot that's been going on, and a lot of contention over things that had previously just been considered just natural rights, things that have been considered staples of society. But a lot of them are being challenged, upturned, not necessarily all for the positive either. In the sense of that, how do you see the future of the United States? I know I don't want to end on a depressing note, but
no, it's fine. I mean, I just to follow up. Yeah. I just your viewers listening and plug it. I do social media, and I just finished. I'm just middle of finishing up an episode for my outlets that's addressing a part of this question. I personally, besides doing media stuff, I'm actually an active member of my local Republican Party. I do volunteer work, and I have done volunteer work. I've worked for the party. I do various political contract work in fashion. And I don't know the answer to that question, and I won't pretend to know the answer to the question, but I do know where we're heading. I do know where we're heading if we're not careful, and what I think is happening right now. And I see this happening on both the right and the left, on multiple layers, on various different levels of each, where it's no longer, the conversation is no longer what's right or wrong or what's true or what's not true. It's what will win. And basically what we're doing is we are willfully dispensing with new. And the reality is, like, and I think that's what fascinates people about the Proud Boys, is that on the face of it, when you look at the Proud Boys in 2019, it's a very nuanced and complex organization. I don't think anyone's ever seen it before. I sure as hell before. But then if you like actually engage with it, it's what Americans have been doing forever. It's just people of random and various backgrounds coming together because they agree on something or whatever. Because they have a common goal or common whatever, and they congregate and they have each other's back and yada yada yada. They form community. It's just what Americans have been doing. But I think the reason why it seems so bizarre in 2019 is because we are told by every single media outlet, by every institution, that that's no longer acceptable. So I don't know what the outcome of America is going to be, but I know that if we don't start to embrace nuance, and have a more sophisticated view of these topics going forward, that we will cannibalize. I think that's what I'm afraid.
Mm-hmm. I think I do have one other question for you, actually, because I know that this is one that's come up quite often, at least not necessarily from general mainstream sources, but more so from just engagements that I've seen online when it comes to critiques of the Proud Boys. Has a lot to do with the method of trolling online or just shit posting in general and the like.
Yeah.
So considering that, and I've seen a fair share of it myself, and I'm not going to lie, I find some of it absolutely hysterical. But do you think that type of behavior is a positive, a negative, or something just kind of neutral as far as the organization's concerned?
That's a good question. That's a very, very complex question. Let me think about that one.
It's what is the Tao of shit posting?
Exactly right. No, I mean it's one of those. Okay, so like just like anybody else, this is one. I'll start with this. The Proud Boys are open to criticism by everyone. I have no problem with people not liking the Proud Boys because they just don't like it. That's fine. My only issue is when they don't like the Proud Boys based on a lie. So, people are people. Am I saying that the Proud Boys are angels? No, of course not. We're human beings. And we all make mistakes. But, you can't conflate an individual online in a forum being overtly provocative to inciting like the third coming of some sort of ethnocentric state. And I think that's the issue. It's like we do live in a time where everybody, and I think this is transcended the Proud Boys, American clickbait sensationalist mentality. And I think there's a time for satire. There's a time for provocation. But I think all of us really we need to understand the psychological algorithms of ourselves and be like, you know what, maybe today is not. Maybe this specific moment in time is not a time to be. But in terms of the implications of that, or the implications of that rather on the organization, I mean, we're a group of individuals. We're not no one individual is beholden the organization to regulate or their trolling and clear by the organization. Of course, the only time, and once again, this goes back to the thing I said earlier. The only time that would ever be even a foreseeable issue would be if saw an individual who was blatantly endorsing authoritarian technology, who And that has happened, and I think that's another part that the public doesn't realize, that the Proud Boys as a collective has had to deal with removing certain members from our ranks who did cross over the authoritarian right, because we as Proud Boys don't like Nazis, and they don't like us. They have called us everything from controlled opposition, quote unquote Zionist shills, everything you could think of, race mixers, every every kind of predictable alt-right and or neo-Nazi pejorative you could think of. They've called us that. So that's the only time that the organization as a whole to really scrutinize a member is if they actually engage objectively authoritarian right-wing behavior. But if someone wants to go crazy with if someone wants to go super honk, wants to go nuts with a honk meme, or wants to go nuts with Keck, or whatever the meme is of the day, that's internet culture. And I think every American, left and right, is guilty of. I'd say every American, left and right, is guilty of taking the internet satirizing a bit too far sometimes and not being self-aware.
Yeah. And it's a good thing you clarify that you made mention of that too, is the notion of separating an organization from the individual. And that's something that I think in, not just when we're discussing things like this, like say a few people do a few things that makes you mad and all of a sudden you're judging the entire group. And I find it almost ironic when people do that with an organization, because usually the people that jump to make those kinds of conclusions are the same people that say that they're against collective judgments. They're the people that will say, they're the ones that throw out all the buzzwords of the day, where they call anytime someone farts or coughs, it's racist or bigotry or whatever else have you. And it's some form of gross collectivism. And yet they make the same kind of snap judgment calls on an organization or on a group of people based on their limited interactions with a few of them, rather than shifting that over to something more definitive, as in judging the individuals themselves. So I think that's something that would be really good if we had that at top of mind when we look at politics in general, not just when we're assessing a certain organization or another, but just North American politics in general needs that understanding that when you're talking to someone, you're not talking to your quote unquote political opposition, you're talking to another person. And I think that discourse and that understanding that you're not up against the entirety of the Democrats, the entirety of the Republicans, you're not in that situation when you're talking to one person. I think that would open the dialogue up a lot between people that have disagreements. Just so that we're not pushing this too far here, though, I do want to thank you very much for coming on the episode. Before we close anything out, is there anything key that you want to either plug or make mention of before we wrap things up?
Yeah, sure. For those out there, I run a independent center, culture libertarian right-wing media outlet called Narrative Assassin. I have a YouTube channel where it's the main core of it, Hussain Hill on YouTube. I'm on Subscribestar, Narrative Assassin on Subscribestar. It's $1.99 a month. In that account, you can get exclusive material only found on that. Narrative Assassin is also on Facebook. Narrative Assassin is also on Twitter. And as Narrative Assassin, I will be doing a live talking event, ironically, about the Proud Boys, coming up in North Carolina, and Cary, North Carolina, in August. And there'll be details on next upcoming episode.
Perfect. All right. So again, thank you very much for coming on the episode today. You can listen to our podcasts on the Think Liberty Network, wherever you get your podcasts. You can read the daily articles that come out on any of the 3 websites that I mentioned at the beginning of the episode there. You can follow me personally on Facebook with just by searching Killian Hobbs Author. And if you liked what you heard and you'd like to hear more, I'll see you again next week.